If you've been following the news closely, you would have been following events trailing the military coup in the Republic of Niger. And even as ECOWAS contemplates military intervention to restore constitutional order, I have been following very closely the narrative around France's economic interests, not just in Niger, but in Africa as a whole. Well, I'm glad to have with me virtually from London an internationally recognized and respected African investment advisor, Simiso Velempini, who has spent the last 15 years advising clients on political developments, high-level stakeholder engagement, and integrity risks, as well as crisis and reputation management in Africa. She is the founder and MD of Vele Africa Advisory, a London-based Africa-focused strategic advisory firm. She has a master's in international security, international relations, languages. Thanks for joining me on the show today, Simiso. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So the first thing I wanted to find out from you was just help us kind of capture the extent of France's economic influence in West Africa, or at least in the Francophone part of Africa.
Sure, absolutely. I believe a lot of your viewers are quite familiar with the term Francafrique, which was coined in the post-colonial era in terms of encapsulating France's relationship with African nations, particularly their former colonies. I think what's significant is that roughly 2 years ago, President Macron made a huge statement where he essentially said that France is looking to reconstitute or recalibrate its relationship with Africa. And obviously that begs then the question of what was the previous relationship and what kind of change was needed. I think across the board, there's widespread recognition that it's predominantly quite an exploitative relationship economically and has not allowed former colonial Francophone states the same type of access and opportunity for development. And I think this is largely, we can talk about this in a bit more detail, but I think the CFA franc plays a huge role in this. And that's why we've seen a strong push to look to reform this monetary system to allow for more flexibility of member states, and also just to decrease the influence that France has on its former colonies.
So do you then think, having said that this crisis in Niger marks a turning point in that what some perceive as an exploitative relationship and the end of France's influence in Africa's Francophone economies? Especially we're seeing the ban on gold and uranium exports by the Nigerian authorities to France.
Absolutely not. It's way too early to call for something like that. And I think it's important to really think about how entrenched France is in Francophone West Africa specifically. And I think there are three main pillars of looking at this. The first is, you mentioned Niger, so we're going to talk about the military relationship that France has with a lot of Francophone West African nations. One of the main issues that has been put forward by the junta is they have been disappointed in the progress made by French military intervention in trying to stem insurgents operating across the Sahel. This is a sentiment that was echoed by current regimes in Mali and Burkina Faso as well. So obviously France is still militarily involved in the region, but a lot of countries that are hosting French troops are not seeing the benefits of this relationship. But having said that, France has also declared quite almost unilaterally that it's not seeking to completely leave the continent from a military perspective, but will maintain a presence. Two other aspects I think are important to think about is the diplomatic relations between France and Francophone African nations. I think not enough attention is spent on thinking about the fact that a lot of the political elites are educated in France. A lot of the military train in French military and American institutions as well as British, but predominantly those. And that strong cultural affiliation persists. And so I think when we talk about France disengaging, the question is, what does that look like when it is so entrenched? And then obviously there are the strong economic ties as well, which are really predicated on this monetary union, which France will continue to influence even once it has been reformed.
And of course, important point you make there about the economic ties, but looking at the strong cultural relations, it seems that even the economic ties, particularly the pegging of the CFA franc, which is used by the West African Monetary Union countries, the Francophone West African nations, to the French franc via the euro, could also be shaped by the strong cultural links between the political elite of West Africa and France. And so what are the implications of this for the monetary union in West Africa, particularly as a lot of economic and trade progress depends itself on political will? What is the future of the West Africa Economic and Monetary Union of countries?
Well, a big question. Unfortunately, we have a lot of very smart economists and policymakers that are wrestling with that issue. But in terms of the official track, President Ouattara and Macron several years ago announced that the monetary union will be evolving to create what will be known as the ECO. And this will allow for increased monetary independence by West African states. And it will allow for France to no longer sit as a board member in the regional bank. However, it will still maintain a degree of influence by remaining a guarantor. It's not a neat and it's not a tidy solution. It's progress in the right direction. I think the challenge is going to be convincing the electorate, which, as we've seen, is leaning in some countries towards more anti-French sentiment. I think the question is going to be around whether this is progress enough, quickly enough. The benefits of the monetary union are that it allows for lower inflation. However, and this is widely acknowledged, that the monetary union has also stifled the development of local industries and has really set a lot of these countries back in terms of addressing some of their developmental challenges. So the question is, within this reconfiguration of the monetary union, how will that enable and how will that allow member states to industrialize a lot quicker and to have more flexibility to address some of their socioeconomic challenges.
Yes, and it has to be said that one of the phenomenons economically we're seeing in the West African Monetary Union of Francophone countries and Guinea-Bissau is that the currencies have been somewhat overvalued, some would argue, and that's, like you said, stifled exports because exports have been a lot more expensive and so stifling the growth of trade. But if we look at specific types of French interests in the region, and I'll take the example of Niger, Arriva is one of the biggest producers of uranium, and it supplies uranium to France's nuclear reactors. I think pretty much more than a third or almost half of its uranium needs, France's uranium needs, come from Niger. But last week, if you're watching my show, I also mentioned that Niger was 189 out of 189 countries on the Human Development Index. So some people are supportive of the ban on uranium exports, but the reality is uranium also gives revenues to the Nigerian governments. So is it a case of, it's a double-edged sword here for the Nigerian authorities, don't you think? And what would be the broader implications of stopping France's investments in the country? And what are the alternatives for the Nigerian authorities, really?
Well, definitely the decision to ban uranium exports to France is Niger's way of cutting off its very French nose to spite its face. In the short term, it may make political sense. It makes for really great headlines and it rallies public support for the junta. However, in the medium to long term, it is definitely not in Niger's interests. Yes. France and a lot of countries who do import uranium do have stockpiles, so there is a buffer, and they can weather this out. Additionally, France can look to Australia or Canada or other countries to supply them with uranium in the short to medium term. The question is whether Niger can survive without these exports. And it's highly doubtful, and I think particularly when you look at the basket of sanctions that have been imposed, as well as the current administration's decision to close all land and air borders, which obviously has an impact on trade and exports as well. So it's very muddled. It's very some would argue it's slightly nonsensical. It's very short term. and it's going to cause a lot of hardship for Nigerians who may, in sentiment, be supportive of what is going on, but they will start to feel the economic pinch very soon.
Indeed. And, it's such a difficult one to tackle because many would agree that a lot of the historical relationship has been exploitative from the West in parts of Africa. But how do you see, and very briefly as we've come to the end of the show, how do you see these events impacting regional trade generally amongst West African countries, especially as many as reading as a standoff between the Anglophone bloc led by Niger within ECOWAS and the Francophone bloc, if you like, in quote, led by Niger and a few other Sahelian countries?
Well, firstly, I think anyone who's probably in the region at the moment has seen how much, or has seen the headlines about how the price of onions, for example, in Ghana has increased as a result of this. And, we also look to border villages and towns with Niger and Nigeria, for example, looking at how the closure of the land borders there has impacted communities on either sides of the border. I think also particularly taking into account that a lot of this trade oftentimes is quite informal. It has an impact on people's day-to-day livelihoods. I think more generally what this crisis, or rather what the situation in this coup has demonstrated, is that ECOWAS cannot sit on its laurels when it comes to taking swift action in response to unconstitutional changes in government. As you mentioned in your earlier responses, ECOWAS has now greenlit a standing mission or mission to intervene militarily in Niger. In terms of the ECOWAS framework, there are various ways in which it can do that. It's not to say necessarily it's going to be guns blazing, but to pull this force together is going to take several weeks.
Indeed.
And in the process, there has to be a diplomatic track that has to be adhered to. I think this is a really interesting point in which West African countries will come together to think about not only the security implications of these changes in government, but also how they interlace and how they interact with broader instability in the region.
Thank you. Indeed. I mean, we're all suing for peace. Nobody wants war, but it has broader implications beyond just politics. There's also the economic ramifications for not just Niger, but the entire West Africa region. Thank you so much for joining us from London. Simiso Velempini, African expert and founder of Vele Africa Advisory. Thanks for joining. Well, that's it from us here at Business Week. Tune in next weekend for more business stories. You can find me online to continue the conversation. And until next time, I'm Rolake Akinkunbe Filani. Bye for now.